meeting started. Any oral communications? No oral communications. So, go over the minutes.
I found the meetings, the minutes were acceptable, so I motion that they approve them.
I second.
Voting is open. Motion approved, 3-0. All right, the floor is yours, Reno.
So I'll be, whoa, that's a lot louder than normal.
Let me see if I can adjust it over here.
Testing, 1, 2, test, test, test. All right, I'll keep talking. That's a little better, yeah, there we go. All right, so the main section today of presentation will be going over the fiscal year 2024-25 collection budget that I sent you. I'm going to pull that up right now on my end. Not my favorite format, but we'll go through it. Well, some changes, but essentially I'm going to go by collection, and then if you have any questions during each of the collections, feel free to ask me what's going on or where we've moved the monies around. Just as a reminder, the collection budget is separate from the money LS&S receives. It's an entirely separate budget outside of the operations and contract. It is set by the city. It is currently, and has been for the last few years, $250,000, and it's funded through the development fund that the city uses. So that funding is derived from new construction, things of that sort, and then those are then funneled to different projects, including, in our case, the library's collections. So again, that's $250,000. The total budget you'll see here in the collection is a little bit less than that because we include things like taxes and also additional processing fees, like putting on stickers, barcodes, etc., beyond what is just the upfront cost of the book or DVD, etc.
If I'm not mistaken, it's been unchanged since 2017.
Correct. It has not increased at all since 2017 when the library first came under contract with LS&S. And it is always encouraged and optional for the client, in this case the city, to increase it as is deemed necessary. I will mention that because it has not increased, that does mean that effectively it has decreased due to inflation. And so that does dictate a little bit of the proposals I'll be representing today. Because of the rising cost of certain items, we've had to reduce certain collections, at least the budget items, particularly we'll see in the digital kind of databases and ebook sections. So we're going to start off with adult print. If you were looking at this through the Excel spreadsheet I sent to you, it was a little bit more organized, but you will notice the first page, which is the one I'm looking at right now, has the budget overviews. There was another tab that looked kind of like this, that goes through circulation, what percentage of the circulation each of those collection codes represent, number of current items, percent of that circulation in that collection as far as what is that collection percentage representing the whole, and then RU is relative use. And I can go into that once we get into the nitty-gritty if you'd like. But we'll touch a little bit on relative use in this first page. So adult print, we'll see previous year budget, not overall many changes. In fact, the total adult print budget increased from 48 to 54,000. You might note that, for example, adult fiction went from 21,000 down to 12. We did not take away in totality. You can see the total increase is just a different use. Rather than using a lot of the purchases for adult fiction and adult nonfiction, those are now going to what is a lease program. You'll see that under adult lease fiction, adult lease nonfiction. The lease allows us more flexibility in how we use the funds. So rather than buying 10 copies of a bestseller, which is what we've been doing, we can buy 2 and then lease the other 8, etc. Once the book is no longer trending or popular, we can return the leased items and get the next popular item in the New York Times bestseller, for example. So we're stretching the budget and getting more out of it and not having to keep extra copies that aren't being used on the shelves, both taking up shelf space and not really being used in other ways by the patrons. So that's the goal of transferring some of these adult funds towards the lease, both for fiction and nonfiction, with most of the funds going towards fiction for that goal.
So in the past, we've never used this before that I know of.
Apparently they did it ages ago, but they stopped for some reason. I don't know why.
Okay, and so this is, I had not heard of this until you brought it up for this year, so it must work well. And so the patrons aren't going to notice any difference in availability, but we're just not going to have a bunch of copies in 6 months that no one will ever use.
Correct. And that is the goal. We want to make sure that we're keeping it fresh, and this gives us those flexibility. The library in the past had tried to find alternative uses for those extra copies. So for example, we had the book club in a bag, but the reality is if those book clubs in the bags aren't made at the time when that book is popular, they're not necessarily going to be circulating 10 months from now as a set of 10, because it's no longer in the mindset of the audience. And so we're trying to make it so that way we have more of those funds available for bulk leasing of very popular items. It also helps with holds. So if we want to keep our holds ratio down, being able to order more leased copies of that item to fulfill those holds is one method, as well as addressing the needs of the community.
So are you able to increase the breadth of the collection by as well as, let's say, having less holds on the popular items? So you're accomplishing two things with this.
Correct. And that's one of the reasons why we included a lease for nonfiction. So for the nonfiction books, the needs are a little bit different. Rather than necessarily targeting popular bestsellers, we're targeting books that go out of date quickly. So for example, new computer books or things that are very much year-to-year updates. Rather than having to have backdated editions, we can have the freshest and multiple copies of the freshest items on the shelves, which will be more relevant, and therefore we expect to have better circulation of our nonfiction.
Okay, several years ago, I got a study from Jennifer Giltrop that covered, like, I want to say 20 or 30 libraries, not all LS&S, part of them, some were, some weren't. And it lists how much they spent, how many patrons they had, the size of the city, and what their collection budget was. And we were kind of in the middle of the pack. Where are we now?
I can't say off the top of my head where we're at just currently. I think the last number I ran had us around spending around $3.5 per population served per capita, which is still, it's low middle of the pack. It is trending lower, again, since our collection budget hasn't increased in the past few years. So if competitor or comparable library systems have increased their budgets to keep up, then as a result, our standing is just going to slide down as the collection budget hasn't increased, but our population has increased in some cases. I can find the exact, because we have the total spending, and I can find out the total amount. The state library and the IMLS, the National Library Organization, both have stats, and they do include in the metrics per capita collection expense. And so you can pull up that information to see where we stand by comparison. So it shouldn't take me too long. I can get that to you pretty fast and some comparables.
That would be interesting. We were talking about the fact that our collection budget hasn't changed since 2017. There's this thing called inflation.
Any questions about the lease or the nonfiction? So we're going section by section.
Okay, so I'm sorry to ask so many questions about this because it's how many libraries use this process?
For leasing, it's fairly common. The last library I was at used it to great success. It's fairly common. It's under Baker and Taylor, one of the major publishing or vendors for materials. I don't have an exact number of how many people or libraries use it, but it's fairly common practice. You'll find, I think, pretty sure, San Diego County libraries use it, City of San Diego as well. It's fairly, technically it's a best practice in that it helps maintain those hold ratios lower at a reasonable price when compared to buying excessive amounts of copies for an item. Because again, the long-term cost is those copies are going to be moving a year or two from now. And so now without shelf space, that could have been used for something else. And again, that shelf space, it doesn't look great if you're browsing and you just see 10 of the same book. It makes you wonder what's going on there.
I think it's a great idea.
I just had one question, Reno.
Sure.
So previous year's budget, the average price per item, and then the proposed budget, which would be, I would assume, a year later, average price per item, they're all the same.
Yeah, so this is based on just what our collections team uses as far as like the standard, like, because some materials will cost more, some will less, and the inflation does increase, but it's really more of a tool to help us count or estimate how many books, in this case, or materials, we can expect. So it's not necessarily an exact representation of market prices. It's more of a tool to make sure we know how many items to expect to help us plan for shelf space, essentially, and for weeding, because otherwise we might not necessarily have enough room in certain areas. We're pretty good on that since we have a lot of shelf space, but since our collections team prepares this for other libraries that are operated by LSNS, and some of those libraries don't have as much shelf space as we do, it's good for them to have that as a data point, and one of the reasons I kept it in, just as an understanding, because sometimes, you know, $12,000 sounds like a lot, but then you see, oh, it's really only 700 books. It gives a nice, and also shows that, for example, $5,000 for adult materials goes only so far versus $5,000 for children's materials, which tend to be less. So sometimes we use that to help us balance out spending, so that way we have good numbers of items, not necessarily based only on the dollar amount. As far as Spanish and graphic novels, so there are a couple of increases. So generally, throughout this, you'll note that I've increased, all the collections budgets have gone up as far as print and physical materials. We accomplished that by removing excessively costly databases, so online digital resources that weren't being used. That's where the bulk of it came from, and some of it did come from changing around priorities of spending on certain funds. Other general notes that we'll go through, we tried to increase budgets for our Spanish collections throughout. In most cases, they're doubled, if not more. So for example, in Spanish adult, both fiction and nonfiction especially, the $675, which would have bought us 30-ish books, was the totality of Spanish adult nonfiction for last year, which I did not believe was, I thought it was an egregiously low amount for our Spanish-speaking populations. So we did bump that up to 5,000 for this year. So we're going from 30 books to 250 books for that collection. And again, this is just from the items that are bought by our centralized collections team. We do have another line item that's discretionary, which adds a little bit more for local selectors that are our library staff here in Escondido. Of course, our centralized staff hear from us, and if we see that they're buying things that don't align with the needs, they adjust. But we also offer local selectors, which kind of focus more on making sure there's not gaps in the collection and also replacing copies that might be either worn, lost, or very popular. And so that's kind of what the discretionary local funding is used. Trying to see if there's anything, I think all went up collectively in adults.
So, okay, I'm sorry, just, I'm really, so far, just really pleased with what you've done here. So, Historically, we've been spending less than $3,000 a year on Spanish fiction and nonfiction.
Correct.
That's almost.
It's basically nothing for the size of our population that speaks Spanish and reads Spanish, and also for the collection budget size.
But Rena, when we go to relative use, we're showing like a critically overstocked position with regard to Spanish fiction. Do you think that's because we haven't been purchasing enough? So
Correct.
people want to go in and
So-
actually get more books that they haven't read before.
Exactly. So relative use is a starting point. It's a tool that helps us inform because, like you mentioned, in Spanish it appears like it's overstocked because it hasn't been checked out. So like the use is low, but that's because the materials on the shelf are very limited and also probably very old.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have items that are being refreshed and aligning with the needs and wants of the community, then that relative use will become skewed by the fact that they're not being used and they're old. So we do keep that in mind, like for example, which is why I ignored that and bumped up the budget.
Sure. With the execution of this, I don't know if we as a board vote, but it would be very great if we could market that, the fact that we're reinvigorating our Spanish collection.
Right. And it's keeping in mind that with our hope, with the redesign and renovation, we are planning to bring Spanish collections for adults more front and center and making it clearer that we have them as part of the effort of injecting more funds into those collections. Because we don't want to be spending funding if people don't know we have them and can't find them. Children's, again, I was surprised by how little funding some of our children's collections were receiving. For example, our most popular items like board books, which are like the books that infants are being read to, so they're like the cardstock type materials. It was less than $500 in last year's budget. This year it's $5,000 because if we look at the use on the next page, our top circulating book or collection is picture books for children, then DVDs, then children's fiction, and then eventually we get into the adult section. But we see a lot of items, and board books are in one of the top categories. It's almost 3% of the circulation, but not even 1% of the total collection. So the relative use is very high, it's almost 4. So that means that as somebody checks out, 4 times as many people want books that are not there, essentially is what this means. And board books are ones that have to be replaced very frequently because these are for toddlers and infants, and they can be messy, they can be chewed on. And buying 50 of those per year makes no sense to me. I really don't understand what the thought process was before. So again, we realigned that to be closer to both the use and the needs of that population. And that goes basically for all the children's items. As we saw earlier, picture books, easy readers were some of our top circulating collections, but our easy reader is less than 2,000 last year. Again, we can do better, so we pumped it up to 7,000. Children's picture books, again, we've doubled the budget because the circulation warrants that. And that kind of goes down the line through all the children's collections. They were not being supported in a way that reflects their use and clearly the need in the community for those collections. So we've done a course correction on that pretty drastically in this budget. So we're going from a children's budget that was $25,000 to one that is $61,000. And again, we're aligning these budgets not just on what we know are the needs, but also the data showing us that these are our top circulating collections. And when I'm proposing these budgets, I go line by line and say, what percentage of the circulation was this? What would that equate to as a percentage of the collection budget? And then based on that, and then make the adjustments that we've been discussing to make sure that those align properly with the number of volumes we need and the use and type of use of those collections.
A quick question there too. That's pretty amazing to see the increase in children's books and stuff. Does that align with attendance during the week as well?
Yes. So, well, when we get to the stats this month, we'll see a dip in attendance, and that's because we paused some of our children's programs, and we paused one of our story times. And that equates to basically almost like 50% drop in visits because we decreased the amount of children's programming last month. So it went from an average of 20,000 visitors to like 11, 12,000. So almost a 10,000 person difference in the fact that we were decreasing our most popular programs. And we did that in preparation for summer reading. And also, basically, to prepare for summer reading is why we pause them, so that way staff can get everything ready. And overall, it balances out because then during the summer, attendance for children skyrockets. So there's an expectation that we're going to have a little bit of a dip the month before in preparation to be ready for that increase during the summer months. But it coincides, our highest searching collections are the ones that are by people that attend the library a lot, which is families and children. And so we have to have collections that are fresh and relevant. And the only way we do that is by funding those collections. And so that was a goal with this year's budget. Teens, which is YA print. Teen collections, they did get a boost, but not a lot, in that we're still working on getting more teens into the library. And a lot of those collections are still pretty good. Again, we're basing it on that CIRC data. And we're not seeing the teens really having the circulation we want. But that doesn't mean we didn't increase certain areas. For example, graphic novels, which are the comic books and manga, those do get pretty good circulation, so we did increase the budget for those. But for collections that aren't seeing that much movement, we wanted to stay about the same or a little bit of a decrease because we want to put the money where it's actually being used, reflected in data. In that case, it's graphic novels. We might see an increase in teen circulation post-renovation because we're hoping to revitalize where the teen spaces are and making it a little bit clearer that we have teen areas and collections for the teens. But that would be something we'll see probably in later years' budgets as we see more of a goal. Because both the collections we want it to reflect actual use, but we also want to make sure that we're not underfunding collections and kind of doing a downward spiral where because they're not circling, we're not funding, and we're not funding because they're not circling. So we are aware of that, and so in certain collections, like Spanish is a great example, people won't check out things if they're old and irrelevant. So we make it so that those become more relevant and newer. That's the goal. Audiovisual, so DVDs throughout the board, they're very popular, but we also receive a lot of donations of DVDs. So we are trying to balance out that budget. And I've also noticed that in the past, there was a lot of duplicate DVDs purchased or added through donations that have just sat on the shelves. So we are trying to be more mindful of DVDs and also mindful of the fact that we're balancing a culture that is both moving away from DVDs and physical media formats, but also understanding that not everyone has access to those, and so there is still a need for us as a library to provide the physical DVD media formats. So that's where we see that balancing act between children's DVDs getting a little bit more, adult DVDs getting a bit less, audiobooks getting substantially less in some cases. We are hoping to phase out audiobooks, but we can still see there is enough CIRC data where we're still funding audiobooks.
And that's like physical.
CDs, correct. Periodicals, so these are our newspapers and magazines. Stay more or less the same. We are decreasing it, and that's partially because people aren't reading magazines as much, and there's less and less magazines to choose from, and the ones that are remaining are getting more and more expensive, especially the newspapers. The bulk of our periodicals budget goes to LA Times, San Diego Tribune, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. The main news periodicals take up a bulk of the budget, and then the rest goes to magazines, the ones we know are circulating or being read through. Correct. These are all physical.
We can access the digital on with our.
Yes, most of the magazines are available. I think almost all of them are available through one of our digital platforms, either Overdrive, Hoopla, or some other ones we have on there. Libby, yep, exactly. Let's see, databases. So databases took the brunt hit of the decrease in the budget. Databases, just as a refresher, is a catch-all term for online resources and tools. A lot of these were databases that had very little use. Some of these databases had a cost of upwards of $50 per user, which is way beyond the scope of where we want to be. Just a frame of reference, if we're getting up to $10 per user, that's already high, and that's usually the comfort limit. And you have to really give me my staff really has to give me an explanation as to why we should keep that database if we're spending $10 per person on it. We want to see more in like the dollar range or less per use in the databases. So that's why that is being decreased. And most of those funds, because nobody was using them, those are now going towards almost all of them towards children's physical items, which we know are going out of the library and keep people coming back to the library. Other things on here are like fees for vendors. The Biblioteca thing was back when we had Cloud Library. It was another one of the ebook platforms. So I don't know why it's listed here. I think it was because it was paid at the end of the last for the prior year. Something happened there, but we didn't have it this year. It's kind of a holdover from a rollover of the accounting. Hoopla, which we're going to look at in the printout I gave you, is being decreased. So let's just turn our attention to the printout I handed out. This is just an outline of, in the first section, the costs per month for Hoopla. Hoopla's unique in that it is a pay per use. So for every download, the library pays a certain amount for either the book, movie, song, etc. that's being downloaded or streamed by the user. We can see here, we started off around 3,500, 3,000 averaging per month earlier in the year. We've now reached the state where it's around $5,000 per month, and that's what I anticipate paying in June. Right now, we're at 2,200, and it's the 13th day of the month, and so we can see that it's very likely projected to hit the $5,000 mark. To the right of that column is the average cost so far for this year, which is around $4,000 per month. And the projected cost, if we were to stay at that same level of expenditure, would be nearly $50,000. If we look back to the spreadsheet, last year we budgeted $25,000 for Hoopla, which is half of what we anticipate having to spend if we were to keep the same pace for this next fiscal. So the average cost per borrow, based on the number of users we have right now at Hoopla, which is around 800 active users per month, means that if we were to spend that much per month, it's around $23 per user. Again, very high, or borrow. So it's $23 for every borrow. So it's basically, rather than buying the ebook, it's downloading it, it costs us $23. The cost per user is $58 per month, which, as I mentioned, is way beyond where we want to be for electronic use. By comparison, Overdrive, also known as Libby, down at the bottom, we spent this last year so far around $20,000, so a bit less than Hoopla. However, the cost per borrow is 35 cents versus the $23, and the cost per user is $10. Again, a little high, but it's closer to where we want to be versus the $60 per user cost.
So are items that are available on Hoopla also available on Overdrive?
Some of them. There is overlap. There is differences in focus. Overdrive has a focus more on audiobooks and ebooks. Hoopla has both audiobooks and ebooks, but it also includes streaming movies and music. So So there's a little bit added functionality on Hoopla, but overall, Overdrive remains our most popular of the ebook resources, which is why the cost per borrow, cost per user is lower. We have set budget, and the number of users is much higher. I think it's 3 or 4 times the number of users per month use Libby or Overdrive versus Hoopla. But the costs are very different. So the structure for Overdrive, we lease digital versions of books, and there's different models. And the most common one is we pay, say, $20 for a title that can be checked out 10 times before we have to re-up and get a new subscription to that book. There are some models in Overdrive that allow us to buy the book indefinitely, so we then own a digital version that can then be checked out by patrons. So it gives us more flexibility in how we spend the money. I will be honest, the selection on Hoopla is a little bit more varied than on Overdrive, but the costs are much more because on Hoopla, every single download is a cost. It's paid per download. And so we currently had not been setting a budget cap per month, which is why the costs have been inflating. And as you saw, we could handle like 1,000 to 3,000 per month and be okay, but we're at the point where we're been too successful at marketing Hoopla, and it has outpaced our budget for Hoopla. We cannot sustain the path where Hoopla is at right now. What we will have to do if we want to continue with Hoopla as an option is decrease the number of downloads per month per library card. Currently it's 5. Our suggestion is to try bringing it down to 3. And then along with that, implementing a monthly budget cap, which we can do to match with the percent, like the amount of money that's going towards that Hoopla budget. In this case, we're giving it 15,000, which would be a little bit over 1,000 per month. And we anticipate that helping keep it under control and within budget. Again, we're trying to put more money towards Overdrive because that did increase in most of the categories because it has been more cost effective and it's being used by more people than Hoopla. So we're trying to balance out not taking away a service that people like that has some things that we can't offer through Overdrive, which are like the movies and the music, but also being mindful of the fact that it is not a sustainable course of action to keep running Hoopla the way we've been running it. It would eat up 50,000. That's, out of a 250,000 budget, we can't spend 50,000 plus on a service that 1,000 people are using. I'd rather spend those monies towards our Spanish collections or children's collections, Overdrives to kind of pump up a service that is popular and has similar items in it. Is just, I think, what I would recommend as the best approach to make sure, within the budget we have, making sure that we keep that. Of course, if at any point we get more funds for the collection, then we could have this conversation again, say, okay, maybe it's 50,000 for Hoopla or our ebook collections, and that would remove a lot of that stress from us and the budget.
We can't be the only library that goes through these. So what's the rest of the successful libraries?
If they cannot gain or receive more funding, they're doing what we're doing, which is proposing a cap on the number of checkouts, so reducing the cap. We've seen that a lot in other California libraries, even in other LS&S libraries where the budgets do not keep pace with the popularity or use of ebooks like Hoopla. And so they've gone from, in some cases, they've gone from 10 checkouts down to 4, 10 to 5. They were like us at 5. They've gone down to 3 or 2. So that is where I'm getting the information as to what is the best approach and trying to balance out not taking away too much while still giving access to those that really need it or benefit from the access.
So the only time I use Hoopla is when I can't find it in the library or on Overdrive.
Yeah.
So I feel that, with the whole leasing aspect of this, it might free up our budget to have more of something that's super popular at the moment.
Right.
And drive people away from Hoopla and then into the library.
Correct. And once we approve this approach, and we might have to vote on decrease because it's a policy change and how many Hoopla items are checked out, that's when we'll have a marketing initiative to let people know, like, look, this is what's going to happen. You can still find items on Overdrive Libby, or you can place a hold through Libby Plus, or contact staff if there's a hold, so that way we can get it through the lease. To give them options, because we don't want to take away options, but we also have to be really mindful of the fact that the budget isn't, Hoopla's budget keeps going off without being capped, and that is not the reality of budgets. And we have to make sure we're staying within the budget we have in a serious and understanding way of how it's used.
How is the OneDrive or Libby budget increase determined? Is it like more content that we're putting money into, or more checkouts per user?
It's both, because they go hand in hand. Like I said, with Overdrive Libby, you buy titles, so you buy access to a title that's there. So we can buy either more per user, like simultaneous users or checkouts of Overdrive, or we can buy more variety of titles. Another thing that's not mentioned in the document is that Overdrive Libby is also boosted by the fact that it's part of our cooperative agreement, the Sarah Cooperative. So when we buy things, other people are also buying them and sharing them with the cooperative. So everybody being able to cooperate more into Overdrive means more people have more access, more variety. We get to see how much local use is, and we can limit some things just to local users. But we also have benefit from the access of having other cooperative members buying and leasing items through Overdrive. Hoopla technically has a bigger master catalog, like overall catalog of things, but again, it's pay per use versus Overdrive, where we might get 10 uses out of a $20 ebook. On Hoopla, you might get 2 or 3, and it costs you $20. Because we're seeing the cost currently is $23 per borrow, which isn't great. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what each borrow costs, but at the average, essentially in Hoopla, it's around like $4 to $8, depending on the format, is what a download costs. Last but not least, discretionary funding. So these are, like I said earlier on, what our local staff selectors are responsible for spending, and they typically highlight replacements for wear and use, making sure that there's gaps in the collections, and like replacements or filling in of series that might be missing an item or two. Because our central team has some ways of doing that, but their priority is in making sure we're getting new and varied collections that align with our collection plan. And they're not necessarily always going in and knowing what's on the shelf or seeing the condition especially. So that's why we have discretionary funds for our local staff, mostly our librarians and our trained specialists to select and order those materials.
So, am I reading this right, that discretionary Spanish is a new category that didn't exist before?
Correct.
Jeez.
There was no funding set aside for local selectors to enhance or replace their Spanish language collection. That is correct.
That seems like a good addition. Just to circle back very quickly,
Sure.
Database subscriptions, what's just like 1 or 2 quick examples of what that means?
Some of the databases, if we were to go to our website, I'm just going to quickly put it up. Basically anything in the books and more, but when we go to digital resources, so you can actually see. Some of these are funded by the state, which unfortunately will be going away. I'm working on a list for our next meeting to let you know what some of those resources might be. But the ones that we paid for were mostly, the ones we're canceling, honestly, were from a company called EBSCO, which is primarily a university, so academic library type vendor. Let me see if I have a good one. So there was like this like biography reference center, points of view, I think is one. There are kind of a bundle of databases provided by EBSCO. They were costing us close to $14,000 a year, and almost no people were using them. And so as soon as I was able to, I asked for those to be canceled. So these are, in some ways, they've been superseded by other resources, Wikipedia, a number of other, now AI. There is some use for them, but in most instances, we are not being used for them. A lot of students get access to them or something similar through their school libraries or school accounts, or through their university accounts. If I had seen good use, I would recommend keeping at least some of them, because that was an option. But the reality is some of these things that were bundled had less than 100 use sessions throughout the entirety of last year, some even less. The only one that I feel a little bad that we have to cancel, but there was not enough use, it was just staff, it's called Novelist. I think it's somewhere here. I'm still learning where they put everything. New website. Yeah, Novelist. So this one's nice. It gives people book recommendations, but there are websites that do that already, such as Goodreads. Yes, and that doesn't cost us anything. And so there are value adds, like this connects to our catalog if we wanted to, but again, there are alternatives that don't cost. In the case of Novelist, Novelist was wanting to charge $6,000. And even though it was the best use, it was still mostly staff using it. And so I couldn't renew that when I could send $6,000 to our Spanish collections, for example. But these are the types of databases that we're trying to cut. We did retain a few, which are in this little box. So the databases we are retaining are Comics Plus, which is our primary platform for digital comic books and manga. It's popular for teens, and it's used during our graphic novel book clubs. And the cost isn't too high, it's $4,500. Gale, which is a Chilton library, so this is the resource for car repair manuals. We're retaining it because we know Cruising Brand is a popular event, and we want to make sure that we have resources for anybody that's interested in learning more about their car, or if they want to get a used car and fix it up. And again, 2,000, it's not so bad. It's a good resource for people to use. People are using it, but it's niche, but there's a reason why we keep it, and that's because there's a local interest for it. Niche Academy is online training, so it's similar to like LinkedIn Learning, or I think there was another one, lynda.com was another one. So it's similar, and it's teaching people like computer basic skills, coding, general skills that might be useful, some certifications. But again, not too expensive, $3,000, and it's a good way of making sure we have some form of tool for economic development, career development in the community. And A to Z databases, this one is used again for business research. So if you want to know what businesses are in the area, what are some good uses of like product costs and potentially building business plans, it's useful as a resource and wasn't really found elsewhere. So we want to keep things that we might be the only source for, or might be, if somebody wanted to get it on their own as a small business owner, it might be a little bit too much of a cost for them. So again, viewing the library through the lens as an economic development anchor and trigger, we want to have some resources to be leveraged in that way. And then, yeah, that's, I think, the main overview of the budget. Any other questions or concerns?
Thank you for that additional context on the database question that I had. Very helpful to understand that our users really don't exist there. It's only 100 used sessions for the past year. Okay.
And I'm happy to send the trustees the data for the databases. We keep track of it because we have to, and we want to make sure that we're making use of the budgets, and that's how we know whether we should keep the database or not. And I'm happy to send those over, but none of the databases we're cutting had a use, either a number of users or the cost per user was too high, which again is why I highlighted Hoopla, because it's turned into that territory where we cannot afford it.
I just have to say, Reno, that I have never seen a collection budget that has been put together in such a thorough, thoughtful way. You know, and I'm convinced just by your thought process that if some of this doesn't work, you'll fix it.
Yeah, and that's the goal. We don't always know whether certain purchases will work out, but that's why we rely both on staff input, public input, and the stats, which don't lie, and then we can use those based on our understanding of what works and doesn't work. All right. Shall I move on to the statistics reports?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, great job, Reno, on the collection budget. I'm equally pleased. It's funny because I always know that John's going to go through the numbers. And if John's happy, we're happy.
Yeah, but Francis keeps catching things that I never even saw.
So we're good.
So it's a team effort.
Yes, team effort. Thank you, Reno. We can move on to 3.
Sure, I'll be brief on these. Statistics, again, like I said, we don't see the dip in circulation or attendance yet. We'll see that in May, just be forewarned. Other than that, April stats were pretty aligned with the trends we've been seeing. Circulation consistently either on the rise or staying flat, but overall the trajectory has been up. Same with e-materials, as we have noticed, Hoopla and others, they have been increasing, and that's great. It means more people are finding us online, finding uses for the library from home. CERC, again, keeps going. Any questions about overall any of the stats here that we have on the statistics report?
I'm always intrigued by the volunteer stuff. Any reason in April that number increased again?
So volunteer stats are intriguing. Part of it has to do with whether like the friends have any sales or activities, things like that. Volunteer stats are made up of 2 components, or really 3. A lot of volunteers that are with the friends of the library, so the bookstore, or like general library support. That's one chunk of the volunteers. The other would be our team volunteers or library volunteers that are helping us with shelving. And then the last one, which isn't always very clear, is our literacy volunteers. So our literacy program has volunteers that help as tutors, coaches, sometimes they support during the lessons that our staff teach. So that's the other component. And essentially the breakdown is we have around 30 to 40 literacy volunteers, and then another 60 or so general, either friends or library volunteers. And of course, we'll probably see an increase in active volunteers during summer, because we'll have teen volunteers that are out of school, so we'll see a little bump up there starting this month, and then we'll probably see the bump down once they go back to school. But honestly, I do think we could have more volunteers and more volunteer hours, and that has to do a bit with how the friends help recruit volunteers, but also institutional processes with the city. So all volunteers have to be background checked as part of city policy, and so it kind of gives us a little bit of a cap. We can't just open up and say everybody can volunteer. We have to make sure that our volunteers are carefully screened and also that they're a good fit. And so I'd rather have quality volunteers at 100 than have 200 volunteers that come here or there, or who knows what they're doing, or just kind of giving busy work. So that is also something to consider too when you're looking at the volunteer stats.
Here, no.
No more questions for stats? All right, then I will move on to our next section of this part, which is the strategic goals. This month, if you looked over it, we're on the second goal, which is embracing emerging services. And so this has to do a lot with our technology and awareness of what the library can do. Some of these I'm now started kind of giving you more, between the last update and now is the focus of these updates, because for a long time I'd seen that it was just the same thing. So this is more of the recent updates. Just so you're aware, our Facebook and Instagram remain about equally popular as far as the number of followers. I hope these will increase as we're starting to implement new policies and procedures internally for how we handle our social media and photography of events. So we should start seeing more photos of events, people and smiling kids and people having fun in the library. And that I've seen typically means more engagement in social media, because people like seeing themselves and their families, and they like sharing that. And so that tends to lead to more followers and engagement of posts. Beyond that, we will have a new marketing coordinator starting soon. So we're hoping to, kind of with a new person in that position, refresh some of our marketing efforts.
I just wanted to add something to that. Going back to our focus groups, we found out that in a lot of the, let's say, what's one of them, education content, they have a lot of, I guess you'd call them mentors or caseworkers or whatever, that would try to help people. And it was so frustrating to realize that they were ignorant of what was already available at the library that they could have these people use. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can address that. And that's not a problem just for this library, it's nationwide.
Yes.
But what's the best way to, try to eat this elephant one bite at a time?
And part of for me right now and the rest of the administration at the library, we're looking at ways of refocusing staff efforts to engage in community partnerships. Because I do think things like that, you need a staff member that is focused on going out and talking to Compact or the schools or nonprofits to educate them of what's at the library, and then partner with them and bring them in so that way if they can, do some other services or connections at the library, whether it's tutoring or it's using the Turrentine room for a presentation or even just tours. That's the goal. Part of that right now is us evaluating what our staff are doing and what the best use of their time is and whether it's being used as effectively as it should be. So that's been, for me, coming in as a new director over the last couple months, 6 months now, 7 months, it's been a lot of that learning and seeing what the staff are doing and then working with their supervisors to see what they believe is the best use of the time and then redirecting focus and energy so that way we can be able to go out to Compact. Like for me, I would have loved to have already gone and met the Compact and done a lot of that work, but my focus has been on, with the lack of better words, cleaning up the library and the state it was in, behind the scenes. While the front and public-facing services have been great, what has led to those in the back of the house has not been as professional as what is presented to the community. It's been a little bit messier. And so a goal is now cleaning that up, and by cleaning up the processes, the procedures, setting new expectations and clear expectations, so that way not only will they have a better understanding and a better back of house support, that should enable them to do even more programs and even better programs than what we've been seeing. A good example, I think, has been the career fair we just did. We had 40 people, 40 vendors there, and we had more than 200 community members visit to speak with the vendors, but it was much better organized than the year before. Each year it's an improvement, and in each year we're finding ways. For next year, we already know we want to buy more tables. We want to make sure we have a better plan with the vendors. And so it's things like that where myself, Dan, Aspen, the admin team are looking to make sure that we're there to support and provide that structure and guidance, but a lot of it has been cleaning up either the lack of structure and guidance or reevaluating and rebuilding things that might have been lost over time. And that's where a lot of my effort has been going to recently. And of course, dealing with renovation. But the end goal is so that way I and the rest of admin can then focus on helping connect partners to bring them back. And then having staff empowered to do that as well.
Nice. I just want to give a shout out to the general theme of raising awareness. You can see things have greatly improved and look better with the watermarks on social media posts and the branding overall. It just seems like it's heading in the right direction.
And we all know it's a slow process, but we're getting step by step.
Is the marketing coordinator a brand new position, or is it a replacement?
It's technically a replacement, but we are refocusing the marketing coordinator. In the past, the position was treated more as a graphic designer that sometimes did marketing. Whereas now it's the opposite. It's a marketing coordinator that helps coordinate the efforts and the strategies for marketing and train staff on proper marketing that sometimes does graphic design. So the emphasis and focus is changing. And with that, it will allow less admin focus on doing those coordination functions so that we can help do bigger picture and bigger community event functions.
And then also for social media, I agree, I definitely see improvement on the other end. But I was wondering if it would be possible to periodically, maybe like once a quarter, compare the increase of followers and posts by year. Like, it would be really interesting to see how far we've come since this time last year.
Yeah, for sure. We do keep track of stats. One of our librarians keeps track of our social media statistics. So I didn't pull them for this, but I can definitely pull them and we can keep better track, especially starting now with a new marketing person. That's going to be one of the responsibilities to help revitalize our social marketing team and also keep track of those stats to make sure. Because, for example, my last library, this librarian, even though it's been open and has only been doing social media for a fraction of the time of Escondido, has almost as many followers as Escondido, both on Facebook and Instagram. And that's because we instituted very clear policies and procedures and really encouraged photo-first approach to our programming marketing. Because it's not just doing the flyers, it's also seeing people in the programs. And that's what we're starting to get to here in Escondido. And I think we'll see great results because we have a long history of support of the library, and we also have a bigger population here. I'm not going to go through all these. Did anybody have any comments or questions about any of the sections? Well, I'll mention that in the section offered services beyond the library walls, I was very happy to hear from our community services department that we're going to be a stop for the Parks Passport. So it's a passport that will be mainly to encourage children and families to visit different parks and locations throughout the city, and the library as being part of the umbrella of community services. We're a stop, so we get to have nice passports. Another way of engaging, but I thought that was a great idea and great to be included in that.
Yeah, if I'm going to add anything, I always look at these highlights that you put together, and just getting those out to the public too would be pretty awesome. I know they can access it through the agendas, but let's be real, not everyone reads the agendas. But if you put some of these highlights on social media, I think people would really gravitate towards it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Thank you.
All right. Last but not least, the library director's report, if we're ready to move there. All right. I didn't have too many updates, I'll be honest, but I have a couple good news announcements. The first one, just as a note, we have a request to kind of slow down on policy provision and new policies. We're happy to answer questions related to that. but I would direct you more towards our friend behind me, from Robert Rhodes, our Community Services Assistant Director and our liaison with the city, if you have any specific questions, but you can always email him, and I am including him in our emails when I communicate with you so that he's aware as our primary liaison and representative from the city. So don't be surprised if you see Robert CC'd on emails from me. But essentially the goal is that right now the city is in the process of, as we know, a lot of different and high priority issues, both relating to budget and other directives from both the city manager's office, city council, and since most of our policies are not life and death, they're mostly nice to haves. For me, I'm okay with kind of slowing down and pausing. We'll still be working behind the scenes to be prepared to include you, and of course you can always tell me if there's anything that you would like me to investigate or prepare that works. It's just, I won't be proposing any new policy, I won't be bringing it up on the agenda, and so we have time to really work on them in coordination with the city, especially the city attorney's office, because we do want to have our policies vetted and make sure that they align with local ordinances, state statutes, etc. And we do rely on our city partners to make sure that that is the case. So that's why that was included in this agenda item.
Robert, do we have a timeline for when we can start back up again?
Thank you for asking the question, and yes, we do. We anticipate by the end of this calendar year that we will be able to get started again. The issue is capacity for the staff within the city, both in the city manager's office and then also myself as the liaison to the library. There's a lot of things that I have going right now that are on my plate that I need to clear before we, Reno and I start working together to address those policy updates for you. Okay.
Gonna add real quick, like in terms of policy discussed today, I think the only thing mentioned was hoopla and potentially changes there. Would budgetary items get paused as well? Do you need that flexibility, Reno, to be able to push for that stuff?
I can definitely, I'll work with probably Robert to just make sure. I think items like there are simple changes, like the number of things that can be checked out or things like that, since they don't really require like review by the city attorney, is there really much
legal statute.
right? That kind of stuff I think is probably okay, but again, I'm gonna try to run it by Robert and see just make sure there's nothing I'm not seeing in that. But minor changes like those updates, they're not really policy, they're not new policy. It's more we're going from 5 checkouts to 3. That kind of thing I think would probably be okay. But again, I'll double check to make sure.
Yeah, and you have full discretion over the budget.
Correct. But I like, of course, having your feedback. Library renovation project. Again, we're still in the schematic and the kind of we're not really at the point where we can share necessarily with the board, but we're very close. And I think we're getting closer and closer. Again, we have our meeting, we have bi-weekly meetings with the engineering firm. So tomorrow I'll know more than I know today. And so by the next meeting we have, I'll know more. And if there's anything major that I think is worthy of you to know before then I'll be sure to share it. But just know that it's still on track, although we are, just as a reminder, the goal is to have all the documentation and everything ready for bids, so that we have somebody on contract by the end of the year around December, so that way construction starts at the beginning of the following year. So we are mindful, the city is mindful of all that, and we're pushing, of course, the firms that we contracted to help us make sure that we meet those goals. But as of right now, I don't have much in the way of updates. Like I said, if it was next week, I'd probably have more, but nothing at the moment.
I think our major concern there was that we're hoping that nothing gets crossed off that's needed without asking for us to figure out a way to come together to find other funds.
Exactly that.
So
course.
if you could just keep us updated on that.
Sure, and we're not necessarily at the point where we're like value engineering or cutting things out.
Okay.
We're still we're a ways away from there, and I think prior to that, we'll be mindful of the board's interest in making sure that they do have a say and like advisement on what should be prioritized as far as library services are concerned. Good news now. We've received one grant and tentatively been approved for another grant. So it's actually 34, I don't know why I put 35, but the Bessie Minor Swift Foundation has awarded us $3,400 in grant funds to support the creation of a Lego station and Lego programming aimed primarily at tweens, which, as a reminder, are ages between 9 and 12-ish. So our children's librarian is very excited. She led that grant application development. We also have tentatively been awarded $19,700 from the state library for the Play for All grant, and that's a bigger grant that is aimed in conjunction with some matching funds that were already allocated for children's services to re-enhance and really kind of redo the toddler space. And that's the space you see right when you come into children's on your right, where like the play mats and the little Jeep is. That is where that funding is going to go towards enhancing. So having a lot more play elements, kind of fun things on the wall for the toddlers to play with. There's money in there for allowing us to buy tablets to then make those murals kind of interactive. So that way they can go around on a safari and kind of learn about the different animals pictured on the walls using the tablet. And we'll also include monies for what we call our launch pads, which are tablets that are preloaded with learning things. And we're aiming to get things that are kind of safari or animal themed to go along with the idea of the grant. The full package of the grant was included, or at least the layout and what is being planned was attached to this week's agenda. You kind of see it on my screen. It really includes new mobile shelving, a lot of soft seating, which is what those little shapes are, new rugs, again, animal themed to go along with our space, 2 climbing structures, and then some new tables that are children's height, and along with a lot more chairs that are both children's height and adult height. Because we noticed there's a lack of seating for adults, and I've seen a lot of adults sitting on the little tiny chairs. And so we were mindful that we wanted to be an inclusive space. And so if you see, these are the types of mobile shelving, kinds of seating. So there's varying heights of the squishy, again, all squishy because it's a toddler space. And lower tables, again, with rounded corners, because again, children's space. And then some other ones that are kind of farther away for their older siblings. And this is kind of our approach as we recognize that the first floor is going to get the bulk of the attention during the renovation. So we are constantly looking for alternative sources to enhance our children's space, which was not included in the renovation grant. This grant, you will probably hear and receive the award letter if all goes well, probably by the time we next meet. Again, it's a state, so sometimes we work not as quickly as we would like, but that would be my expectation. Again, as these are all grants and the city is a recipient, all these have to go to council for acceptance and then budget amendments in the budget. So once we receive it, then Robert and I, mostly with Robert's help, will submit it to council, and then as a consent agenda item, it will be accepted into the budget.
Rena, could you let us know when that's coming up in front of the council?
Sure. Marketing coordinator we've already discussed, and adults highlights again. Prior to the job fair, we had job readiness workshops at the library, which were popular. We also had, of course, our monthly concert, which we continue to do. Pioneer Room. Of course, I'm a big fan of our Pioneer Room, but they've been doing some fun kind of field trips and working with Girl Scout troops, bringing in students to learn more about Escondido's history and through the lens of our Pioneer collections in the Pioneer Room. Of course, Star Wars Week. I was the official photographer for that day to kind of show staff what kinds of photos I like. And these are ones that are examples of the ones I like. But as usual, Star Wars Week was very popular. We had hundreds of people in attendance at most of all the events. And it's a great way of celebrating both. And that week it's because it leads up to May the 4th, which is also Free Comic Book Day. And so the Star Wars week leading up to May the 4th, May the 4th be with you. And that is my report for this month.
Any questions? I know it's not June yet, but I was really, you guys did a really good job of selecting the Juneteenth event and the coding that is behind that. And it was like, I was like, wait, what? I never heard about this before. But you guys did a great spin on that.
That's the Code to Freedom. It's learning how quilting was used as part of like both the Underground Railroad, but also just generally as providing messages, coded messages to free and enslaved people.
So it's like a coding event that you're
Correct.
hosting on the 19th that kind of tied it into that. So it's pretty awesome. Very unique. Okay, we can move on to the library director's reports.
That's the report.
Oh, trustee reports, sorry. John, would you like to start? Would you like to start?
Well, I was gone for over half the month, but I had this reference book on that had about 20 pages on the Marquesas, it's the islands where I was going, and I got it on link.
Okay.
Okay, and set right on the front of this. It was basically just a tourist guide, and the library it came from, which I can't remember the name of it, said, well, you know, if you screw this up, it's going to cost you $150 or something like that. So I had it in a waterproof Ziploc, okay, and kept it cushioned so it didn't get damaged in the corners and all that for the entire trip. But I really think that service is great because I've found books I can't find anywhere else. And some off-the-wall library somewhere will have it. So it's a great thing.
Let's see, about 2 weeks ago, we hosted, Reno and I met with Deputy Mayor Garcia and Liliana Garzon, who's the Love Esco director. We gave them a tour of the library. I don't think Christian Garcia had been there. Oh, Christian. Yeah, Christian Garcia, yeah. Had been there in over 10 years. And Lillian, the same thing, she had gone for a high school tour. So they hadn't visited in a long time. The cool thing is Lillian from Love Esco had their social media person join us as well. What is it?
I don't know.
Oh,
I said fantastic.
Oh, fantastic.
Sorry.
Yeah. I can't remember her name right at the moment, but she was also there on the tour. And she was taking footage for their Love Esco social media, which I think they're developing, whatever that they're going to release on their social media. They're doing edits and things like that. But it was really fun. So Reno had a chance to have that FaceTime with Deputy Mayor Garcia, and he specifically asked, like, how can we support you and maybe give ideas of things that we need budget support assistance with. So I think that was really well. My plan is to still invite the rest of the council members. So now we have already hosted the mayor and deputy mayor, so we'll reach out to the rest of them and invite them and coordinate those individually. Then on the next day, I went to the Literacy Services dinner graduation event. That was fantastic. It was my first time going. Absolutely loved it. I plan to go every year. So it was the literacy program graduates. So we got a certificate, got to go up on stage and speak. And I just think that's such a wonderful benefit that we offer to the community. And I also reached out to the Friends of the Library Board to just have a meeting with them to learn more about what they're doing, what their initiatives are, and establish a relationship. And it was, I don't know if it was well received, but they kind of called me back and said, what do you want to know? And you can't come to our board meeting, but we'll meet with you before our board meeting. And so I spoke to Georgia Chunko. Do you know Georgia? Okay. So anyway, I'm going to meet with them before their next board meeting on July 10th at 9:30. And I was going to see if Francis or Maribel wanted to join me since you guys are part of the outreach committee, which I could send an email so that Maribel has to get a chance to be asked as well. And we can decide if one of you would like to join me for that meeting.
Yeah, let's sync up on whether I can make it or not. You
Okay.
said July 10th?
July 10th at 9:30. I think they meet at the library arena. Do you
Correct.
go to their
What
board
day is that?
meetings?
I do.
Yeah, I don't know if I can, but we'll see.
Yeah, I do attend when I can, I do attend their board meetings, and I'll say that at yesterday's board meeting, they mentioned, and they were much more positive about the fact that you and potentially other trustees will be attending.
Okay.
So I don't know who you spoke with or what the impact, but at least generally the board was much more positive and receptive to it, at least what they told me. That was my impression. So
Maybe
I was
I
very,
surprised them. They were like, "Who is this and what do you want?" So anyway, we'll form that partnership, and they'll get to know the board, and I'll get to know them better. So good. I'm glad you had positive feedback on your side because I think I just surprised her. So that's all of my interactions with I was at the library. Oh, one other thing. I went to the library for a pause for reading, even though I'm not a child and I don't have a little child that was there. I just went and spied on the program. So they brought the service dogs in and they read to the dogs, and it was so cute. I could see how that's such a good benefit for the kids, especially if they're not allowed to have dogs.
Right.
You know, and wherever they're living, and they get that one-on-one time with the puppies. I loved it. It was really fun.
and the goal is, of course, if anybody's ever curious or wonders why we have kids read to dogs, it's to help reluctant readers, because there's not as much pressure when you're reading to a dog than it is to like reading for a class or even reading with like your parent.
Or even reading to a dragon.
Yes, or Bearded Dragon program, which is also great.
Okay, I'll just go right into it. Those are great updates, Virginia. I don't have much, just that my kids continue to use the library and they enjoy it. And hopefully a lot of people participate in the summer reading challenge coming up.
I also got to go to the Literacy Learners Dinner. I sat next to two learners, Juan Carlos and Mina. And I think it was just very moving. It was the first dinner I'd been to since before COVID, I think, when I had just gotten on the board. And in that first year that I was there, it was much more, I think, focused on folks who really just never had the opportunity to learn to read. And this year I felt like it was more focused on folks who are coming to the United States and are learning English. Just the amount of appreciation they had, and how many of them remarked on how important it was for them to learn English and become part of the community was just so fantastic. And just such a great, I think thing that we can offer people who are coming here, and may not have had that opportunity in the past. So it was really phenomenal. We had folks from Brazil, I think Mexico, South America, and then I think there were some Ukrainians as
Yes.
well. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it was really just very, very wonderful.
I'll mention we were all happy to see both Carolyn and Virginia there. My being the first time attending as well, I was very moved to see the breadth and the impact of our literacy services, and it just reinforces what I already knew, which is that we need to promote our literacy program more, which is one of the reasons why we moved it when we redesigned the website to be clearer and more obvious that we have it by providing a button and a clear location of navigation. But it's a long-term project to make sure that our marketing efforts also reflect what our literacy program does, because it's been hidden and it hasn't been a priority of marketing in the past.
Yeah, wonderful. Any other topics to discuss? We can adjourn. Thank you so much.
Reminder, next meeting is at 6.
Oh, that's it.